Walibi is set in a tranquil forest, supposedly somewhere in South America. The silence and beauty of the jungle is contrasted with the brutality of the colonizers forcing the men into hard labor and pillaging the natives' villages. The Illa girl's beauty, her face adorned with colorful flowers and her body painted rich black, red, and purple, draws admirers from all over the continent. The narrator finds her lying close to dead on the ground, handcuffed to a stake, with her thin bones clicking from weakness. By exaggerating her innocence and purity, Wally juxtaposes her fragility with the brutality to which she is subjected. The narrator has an implicit belief in preserving bodily purity. He refuses to eat food out of a tin can and pours out his alcoholic drink. Before he kills the Illa girl, he cleanses himself with water. The narrator's insistence on keeping clean is juxtaposed with the colonizers' impurity. Their practices, their alcohol, their canned food, their lack of regard for physical cleanliness, is symbolic of a state of lawlessness and savagery. Wally uses first-person point of view. It is one of the only overtly political stories in Eva Luna. Because Wally directly approaches the topic of colonialism and is said much earlier in history than Allende's other stories, Allende might not feel like she has the right to approach it from her own point of view. The first-person point of view also allows the reader to understand the story in terms of personal emotions, not in terms of plot. We understand the deep love and empathy the narrator has for the Illa girl, the sorrow of seeing her so abused, and his relief when her soul is freed from her body. In If You Touch My Heart, Hortensia is physically locked in a dark, confined space. She is completely abandoned. Amadeo often forgets to give her food, and completely in the dark. The stifling physical environment sets the scene for her mental abandonment and lack of human connection. We can see the effects of Hortensia's solitary imprisonment through her physical changes. These effects create a depressing mood that surrounds her abandonment. Hortensia begins to turn into a subterranean creature, years after being left in the cellar. Her senses grow sharper, and her body begins to deteriorate.
Ennis, a seemingly harmless schoolteacher in a quiet town, is totally nonchalant and without regret after committing murder. Her character is the epitome that shows what effect personal loss can have on a person. Not only did it drive her desire for revenge, but it also clouded her morality. The theme of The Schoolteacher's Guest is personal loss and suffering can cause people to take justice into their own hands. Ennis specifically states her reasoning for murder or revenge when she says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Fate or mystery acts as an element of magical realism in The Schoolteacher's Guest. The man who murdered Ennis's son ended up back in the town of Agua Santa after a rock hits his truck's windshield. This destined event allows Ennis to get vengeance on her son's murderer. Nonlinearity is another element of magical realism that exists in The Schoolteacher's Guests. The prominent events of the plot were not told chronologically as the story started in media res, where Ennis had already killed the man who murdered her son. The story then proceeds to explain the events that lead up to this action. The plot consists of three primary events that are essential in developing the theme of the short story. The first was Ennis's son's death, who was picking up a mango on an owner's property. As we are revealed the source of Ennis's suffering when her son died, we can better understand why and how she takes justice into her own hands by murdering the man that killed her son. The main conflict of The Proper Respect is man versus society, where Abigail and Domingo Toro struggled to gain respectability in society. As the Toros try to resolve this conflict, we can see where greed can cloud their sense of morality. Characterization is a prominent element of fiction in The Proper Respect. Throughout the story, we start to understand that Abigail is obsessed with becoming part of the upper class. Greed starts to take over her life as everything she does is to reach this goal of gaining not only wealth, but class. The resolution of the main conflict in The Proper Respect occurs when Abigail Toro is kidnapped by the Red Pumas. She is returned after her husband gives them an undisclosed amount of money. We are not directly told that this was manipulated by Abigail herself, but we can infer that the kidnapping was her doing in order to move higher up in the societal ranks. Authorial reticence is a main element of magical realism in The Proper Respect. The author hints that the kidnapping could have been planned by the Toros, but Allende does not explicitly state that it wasn't a coincidence. This uncertainty allows the reader to interpret the story in different ways. It makes the story more dynamic and interesting. If Abigail did plan the kidnapping, it would have been due to greed for respectability in society.
The story is set in a classical romantic setting, in other words, a South American rural environment in which elements of danger are abundant due to the lacking of a lawful presence. By placing readers in a setting that is familiar to them, one which is rather stereotypical in a given genre and requires few descriptions on the part of the author, Allende is able to focus in on the emotional elements of her story, the theme, and the particular emotional journey her characters are being taken on, as opposed to make room for extraneous detail. After the past and language expertise exercised by Belisa is briefly illustrated through a third-person omniscient perspective, Belisa is kidnapped by the colonel's men and essentially forced to write him a campaign speech. The two develop feelings for one another, but the colonel's ambition outweighs his need for her affection, at least temporarily. The point of view then shifts to focus on the colonel's campaign for president, and illustrates his ever-increasing longing for Belisa. In this way, point of view is used as a tool to directly focus only on the information which is necessary for the emotive theme of the story to be effectively carried across. The colonel is one of the most feared men in the region. His eyes of a ferocious puma are intimidating, but even though he is a hardened soldier, he still seeks praise and love. His hardened demeanor is contrasted with his soft voice, signaling that internally he is a sensitive man. The colonel longed to ride into a town beneath the triumphal arch. He wanted to be cheered. Despite his reputation, the colonel desires love and belonging. Like the colonel, Belisa too seeks belonging, and she finds it in writing for others. Belisa is framed as the protagonist of the story, and the colonel is framed as a threat, but internally they are the same. They find belonging in different ways, but their common denominator is a need to feel like they are part of a greater whole. The emotional force of the story lies between these two characters, and it is through Allende's focus on their characterization particularly, which keeps the reader focused on the emotional themes which she is trying to convey.